Welcome to Quiz Time. I'm your quiz master, Sean, and I've got questions about baby boomers. Okay, us young people, we'll see what we know and what we can learn about the baby boom generation. Shall we? Okay. Which 1960s folk trio featured Peter Yarrow, Noel Paul Stookey, and Mary Travers? The Kingston Trio, the Weavers, or Peter, Paul, and Mary? And that was Peter, Paul, and Mary. What 1950s TV personality famously interviewed Fidel Castro in 1959 during the Cuban Revolution? Was it Walter Cronkite, Jack Paar, or Edward R. Murrow? Jack Paar got that scoop. Which actress won her first Oscar for the 1955 film The Rose Tattoo? Elizabeth Taylor, Anna Magnani, or Sophia Loren? And the winner is Anna Magnani. What 1950s juvenile delinquent novel by Evan Hunter was adapted into a controversial film starring Glenn Ford? The Wild One, Rebel Without a Cause, or Blackboard Jungle? Blackboard Jungle. Which iconic musician performed at Woodstock in a white fringed jacket and headband? Was that Joe Cocker, Jimi Hendrix, or Carlos Santana? And that was Jimi Hendrix. What pioneering 1950s TV show featured a panel of 4 blindfolded celebrities trying to identify a mystery guest? To Tell the Truth, I've Got a Secret, or was it What's My Line? What's My Line? Which author's 1961 memoir, A Movable Feast, chronicled his time as an expatriate in 1920s Paris? F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, or John Steinbeck? Ernest Hemingway. What 1960s fashion phenomenon featured transparent or semi-transparent fabrics in clothing? Granny dresses, the see-through look, or paper dresses? It was the see-through look. Which political movement of the 1960s was founded by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale? Students for a Democratic Society, the Black Panther Party, or the Congress of Racial Equality? It was the Black Panther Party. What 1950s TV character lived at 623 East 68th Street in Manhattan with his wife Alice? Was it Rob Petrie, Ralph Cramden, or Archie Bunker? It was Ralph Cramden. What controversial 1960s film technique involved subliminal messaging to increase concession sales? Was it split-screen projection, 3D glasses requirement, or popcorn programming? Popcorn programming. Which early computer programming language developed in 1957 was named after a mathematician? Was it BASIC, Fortran, or COBOL? Fortran. What 1950s literary movement featured stream of consciousness and experimental narrative techniques? Was it Transcendentalism, Black Mountain Poets, or Modernism? Black Mountain Poets. Which 1960s cultural phenomenon involved women burning an undergarment as a protest against patriarchy? Bra burning protests, equal pay demonstrations, or beauty pageant boycotts? bra burning protests? Which 1969 film featured Jon Voight as a male prostitute in New York City? Was it Easy Rider, Midnight Cowboy, or Coming Home? It was Midnight Cowboy. What popular household item was created by chemist Patsy Sherman after an accidental laboratory spill in 1953? Scotchgard, Teflon, or superglue? That resulted in the creation of Scotchgard. Which political scandal of the 1950s involved alleged communist sympathizers in the U.S. Army? The Army McCarthy hearings, the HUAC hearings, or the Alger Hiss case? The Army McCarthy hearings. What 1950s automotive innovation by Nash featured seats that could be converted into a bed? The Erlanger reclining seats, the hydromatic transmission, or the overhead cam engine? It was the Erlanger reclining seats. Which 1960s pop art movement used everyday objects in artistic compositions? Was it abstract expressionism, color field painting, or nouveau realisme? Nouveau realisme, I think. What controversial 1960s psychological theory by Timothy Leary advocated for the therapeutic use of psychedelics? Set and setting theory, transpersonal psychology, or humanistic psychology? Set and setting theory. Which comedian's 1950s TV show introduced the character of the poor soul? Was that Jackie Gleason, Ernie Kovacs, or Sid Caesar? That was Jackie Gleason. What 1960s music venue on the Sunset Strip was originally called Elmer Valentine's Whiskey A Go-Go? Whiskey A Go-Go, the Troubadour, or the Roxy? Whiskey A Go-Go. Which 1950s medical discovery by Jonas Salk utilized killed virus particles? The smallpox vaccine, the polio vaccine, or the tuberculosis treatment? That would be the polio vaccine. What 1960s hair treatment involved wrapping strands in aluminum foil to create lighter streaks? Is that bouffant styling, frosting, or teasing? And that is frosting. Which pioneering 1950s television journalist hosted See It Now and challenged Senator Joseph McCarthy? Walter Cronkite, Edward R. Murrow, or Mike Wallace? Edward R. Murrow. What controversial 1960s architectural movement was characterized by massive concrete structures? Googie, brutalism, or postmodernism? Brutalism. Which 1950s toy was originally marketed as the whirly-go-round? Was that the hula hoop, the frisbee, or the pogo stick? And that would be the frisbee. What 1960s counterculture publication founded by John Wilcock featured early writings by Yoko Ono and Andy Warhol? The Berkeley Barb, the East Village Other, or the Oracle? The East Village Other. Which 1970s television show featured a Korean War medical unit and was based on a novel by Richard Hooker? Combat, MASH, or tour of duty. MASH. What revolutionary 1950s recording technique pioneered by Les Paul involved layering multiple tracks? High fidelity, sound on sound, or stereophonic sound? That would be sound on sound. Which 1960s French designer created the Mondrian dress inspired by the Dutch painter? Yves Saint Laurent, Mary Quant, or Pierre Cardin? And that was created by Yves Saint Laurent. What 1950s radio format pioneered by Todd Storrs and Gordon McClendon featured a limited playlist of hit songs? Is that Top 40, album-oriented rock, or beautiful music? That's Top 40. Which 1960s novelist wrote In Cold Blood, considered the first non-fiction novel? Was that Norman Mailer, Truman Capote, or Tom Wolfe? That was written by Truman Capote. What 1950s architectural movement was characterized by angular structures and space-age motifs? Is that Art Deco, Googie, or streamline modern? Moderny. Googie. Which 1960s musical group was managed by Brian Epstein and produced by George Martin? The Rolling Stones, the Beatles, or the Who? And that was the Beatles. What controversial 1968 film by Roman Polanski dealt with supernatural pregnancy? The Exorcist? The Omen? Or was it Rosemary's Baby? It was Rosemary's Baby. Which 1950s household innovation utilized artificial flavoring to create a quick dessert? Frozen TV dinners, instant pudding, or cake mix? Instant pudding. What 1960s protest movement was characterized by demonstrations against nuclear weapons? The free speech movement, the campaign for nuclear disarmament, or the Students for a Democratic Society? It was the campaign for nuclear disarmament. Which 1950s science fiction writer created the concept of grok in his novel Stranger in a Strange Land? Was it Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, or Robert A. Heinlein? It was Robert A. Heinlein. What 1960s broadcast technology allowed viewers to receive television signals directly from satellites? Was it cable television, UHF transmission, or TVRO? That was TVRO. Which 1950s sociological study by David Reisman examined the changing American character? White collar, the power elite, or the lonely crowd? The lonely crowd. What innovative 1960s fashion item designed by André Courage featured a hemline well above the knee? Bell bottoms, go-go boots, or the miniskirt? 'Twas go-go boots. Which 1950s musician combined elements of country music and rhythm and blues to create a new sound? Was it Little Richard, Chuck Berry, or Buddy Holly? It was Chuck Berry. What 1960s artistic movement emphasized conceptual ideas over aesthetic form? Pop art, minimalism, or conceptual art? And that would be conceptual art. Which 1950s television personality's catchphrase was, "Good night and good luck"? Was it Edward R. Murrow, Walter Cronkite, or Douglas Edwards? That doesn't sound very encouraging, does it? It was Edward R. Murrow. Classic line, who might argue? What 1960s aviation innovation by Boeing revolutionized commercial air travel? The wide-body jet, supersonic transport, or fly-by-wire controls? And that would be the wide-body jet. Which 1950s jazz musician pioneered cool jazz with his trumpet playing? Miles Davis, Dizzy Gillespie, or was it Louis Armstrong? It was Miles Davis. What 1960s literary movement featured William S. Burroughs, Allen Ginsberg, and Jack Kerouac? The Beat Generation, the Lost Generation, or Confessional Poets? That's the Beat Generation. Which 1950s television show featured a rotating cast of comedians including Sid Caesar and Imogen Coca? Your Show of Shows, The Milton Berle Show, or The Red Skelton Show? It was Your Show of Shows. What 1960s culinary trend introduced by Julia Child popularized French cooking in America? Was it TV dinners, gourmet home cooking, or fast food? It was gourmet home cooking. Add more butter. Which 1950s musician was known as the Hillbilly Shakespeare? Was it Hank Williams, Elvis Presley, or Johnny Cash? The Hillbilly Shakespeare, Hank Williams. What 1960s communication satellite enabled the first live transatlantic television broadcasts? Was it Telstar, Sputnik, or Echo? It was Telstar. Which 1950s educational initiative was created in response to the Soviet launch of Sputnik? The GI Bill, the National Defense Education Act, or the Brown versus Board of Education ruling? It was the National Defense Education Act. What 1960s fashion accessory was popularized by Jackie Kennedy and became a symbol of sophistication? Was it the pillbox hat, white gloves, or the pearl necklace? It was the pillbox hat. Which 1950s television program featured a closing segment called Person to Person? See It Now, The Twilight Zone, or Omnibus? It was See It Now. What 1960s political movement, led by Cesar Chavez, advocated for agricultural workers' rights? Was it the Black Panthers, the Brown Berets, or the United Farm Workers? It was United Farm Workers. Which 1950s literary figure coined the term the Beat Generation? Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, or was it Jack Kerouac? It was Jack Kerouac. What 1960s medical advancement, pioneered by Christian Barnard, involved replacing a vital organ? Artificial kidney dialysis, heart transplant, or pacemaker implantation? It was the heart transplant. Which 1950s children's television personality created the land of make-believe? Was that Soupy Sales, Captain Kangaroo, or Fred Rogers? That was Fred Rogers. What 1960s sports innovation introduced by the American Football League changed how games were broadcast? Was it instant replay? Was it player names on jerseys? Or colorized broadcasts? It was player names on jerseys. Which 1950s theatrical innovation introduced a widescreen format using 3 synchronized projectors? Was that Technicolor, Cinerama, or VistaVision? And the name for that is Cinerama. What 1960s electronic music device created by Robert Moog revolutionized sound production? Was it the Hammond organ, the modular synthesizer, or the electric guitar? It was the modular synthesizer, also known as the Moog synthesizer. Which 1950s scientific advancement by Francis Crick and James Watson revealed a double helix structure? Was that protein synthesis, RNA transcription, or DNA structure? The DNA structure is the double helix. What 1960s consumer protection initiative by Ralph Nader exposed safety issues in American automobiles? The Other America, Unsafe at Any Speed, or the Consumer Manifesto? Unsafe at Any Speed. Which 1950s theatrical movement created by Julian Beck and Judith Malina blurred the line between performers and audience? Method acting, living theater, or theater of the absurd? Living theater. What 1960s social movement advocated for deinstitutionalization of mental health patients? Is that mental hygiene movement, the psychological humanism movement, or the anti-psychiatry movement? That's the anti-psychiatry movement. Which 1950s pharmaceutical innovation by John Enders led to a major disease prevention breakthrough? Penicillin mass production, polio vaccine cultivation, or cortisone synthesis? That would be polio vaccine cultivation. What 1960s television program featured correspondents Charles Kuralt and Morley Safer? Meet the Press, Face the Nation, or 60 Minutes? And that would be 60 Minutes. Which 1950s literary figure published Invisible Man, exploring themes of racial identity? James Baldwin, Richard Wright, or Ralph Ellison? And that would be Ralph Ellison. What 1960s architectural trend featured homes built into natural landscapes? International style? Is it organic architecture? Or is it brutalism? And that would describe organic architecture. Which 1950s technology, invented by Texas Instruments, revolutionized electric devices? Was it the vacuum tube? Was it the silicon transistor? Or the integrated circuit? That was silicon transistor. What 1960s literary genre pioneered by Kurt Vonnegut combined science fiction with social satire? New journalism, postmodernism, or slipstream fiction? That would be slipstream fiction. Which 1950s musician pioneered rockabilly with his recordings at Sun Records? Buddy Holly, Jerry Lee Lewis, or Carl Perkins? And that would be Carl Perkins. What 1960s consumer advocacy organization, founded by Ralph Nader, employed young lawyers known as Nader's Raiders? Common Cause, Public Citizen, or Consumer Reports? That would be Public Citizen. Which 1950s filmmaking technique, popularized by Alfred Hitchcock, created an illusion of depth? Was it split screen, dolly zoom, or depth of field? It was dolly zoom. What 1960s legal precedent established by Escobedo v. Illinois concerned criminal suspects' rights? Search and seizure limitations, right to counsel during interrogation, or protection against self-incrimination? That would be the right to counsel during interrogation. Which 1950s television personality hosted Person to Person and interviewed celebrities in their homes? Was it Edward R. Murrow? Was it Dave Garroway? Or was it Walter Cronkite? And that was Edward R. Murrow. What 1960s theatrical production by James Rado and Jerome Ragney featured the songs Aquarius and Let the Sunshine In? Hair, Jesus Christ Superstar, or Oh Calcutta? Hair. Which 1950s artistic movement, championed by Clement Greenberg, emphasized flat surfaces and non-representational forms? Abstract Expressionism, Surrealism, or Pop Art? And that would be Abstract Expressionism. What 1960s engineering marvel connected Staten Island to Brooklyn, New York? The Verrazano Narrows Bridge, the George Washington Bridge, or the Throgs Neck Bridge? And that would be the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. Which 1950s nuclear test series conducted in Nevada was named after a mountain range? Operation Upshot Knothole, Trinity, or Baker Test? That was Operation Upshot Knothole. What 1960s social phenomenon involved young people traveling cross-country by hitchhiking? Road tripping, commune living, or freedom riding? And that would be road tripping. Which 1950s television personality created the character of the Tramp and rarely spoke on screen? Was that Red Skelton, Ernie Kovacs, or Jackie Gleason? Red Skelton was the Tramp. What 1960s aircraft, designed by Kelly Johnson, was capable of flying at Mach 3 plus speeds? Was it the B-52 Stratofortress, the F-4 Phantom, or the SR-71 Blackbird? It was the SR-71 Blackbird. Which 1950s jazz style, pioneered by Ornette Coleman, rejected traditional harmony and rhythm? Was it bebop, cool jazz, or free jazz? And that would be free jazz. What 1960s defense initiative created a network that would eventually become the Internet? Was that ARPANET, the Space Race, or the Strategic Defense Initiative? That's ARPANET. Which 1950s children's book author created a cat wearing a distinctive red and white striped hat? Was that Dr. Seuss? Was it Roald Dahl? Or was it E.B. White? A cat in a hat? That must be Dr. Seuss. What 1960s literary movement was characterized by experimental forms and metafiction? Well, is that postmodernism, naturalism, or new journalism? That would be postmodernism. Which 1950s television show featured the character of Chester Riley and the catchphrase, "What a revolting development this is"? The Life of Riley, The Honeymooners, or Remember Mama? That's from The Life of Riley. What 1960s aviation advancement by Boeing featured a distinctive hump on the upper forward fuselage? Was it the 707, the 727, or the 747? That was the 747. Which 1950s automotive designer created the tail fin look for Cadillac? Was that Raymond Louis, Harley Earl, or Virgil Exner? And that was created by Harley Earl. What 1960s medical advancement by Willem Kolff improved treatment for kidney failure? Was it the artificial heart, the dialysis machine, or the organ transplantation? It was the dialysis machine. Which 1950s political doctrine outlined by Secretary of State John Foster Dulles threatened massive retaliation? Was that domino theory, New Look policy, or containment policy? That was the New Look policy. What 1960s consumer product introduced by Procter & Gamble revolutionized feminine hygiene? Disposable diapers, Tampax tampons, or Kotex pads? And that would be Tampax tampons. Which 1950s Broadway musical by Meredith Willson featured the song 76 Trombones? The Music Man, Oklahoma, or Guys and Dolls? The Music Man led the big parade. What 1960s photographic innovation by Edwin Land produced instant color pictures? Was it Polacolor, Kodachrome, or Ektachrome? And that would be Polacolor. Which 1950s scientific discovery at Bell Labs enabled modern computing? The transistor, the microchip, or fiber optics? At Bell Labs, they created the transistor. What 1960s musical innovation by Phil Spector featured multiple instruments playing the same notes? 12-tone technique, wall of sound, or the Nashville sound? That would be the wall of sound. Which 1950s television series starred Jack Webb as Sergeant Joe Friday? Highway Patrol, The Naked City, or was it Dragnet? That show was Dragnet. Question 100. What 1960s aviation technology, pioneered by the French and British, featured a drooped nose cone? Was that supersonic transport, the jumbo jet, or the vertical takeoff? We're talking about supersonic transport, the Concorde. Well, you've done an amazing job. Don't forget to like, subscribe, ring that notification bell, and share your score in the comments, please. Oh, and check out these videos right here. They're also a lot of fun. We like making them. I hope you like playing them. All right, we'll catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.